look like? And we're going to continue allowing Daniel to mentor us. And as we are moving our way through the book of Daniel, we're in chapter 5. And what has happened is King Nebuchadnezzar has turned the throne over to his son, Belshazzar. One of the things that has happened is that King Nebuchadnezzar has had an encounter with the living God that has changed his whole life. If you remember, if you've read the book of Daniel, he loses his mind and ends up spending some time out in the tules, laying on the ground for like a while. And finally, as he comes back to himself, God reveals himself, and the king realizes, oh, I'm not the king of the universe. God is the king of the universe, and I serve him. Following this, his son takes over the throne. And the first thing that his son does, chapter 5, verse 1, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles and his wives drank from them. And as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze, iron, wood, and stone. How many of you know that was a bad idea? Yeah. I know, as the first act of my kingdom, let's mock God. Let's just thumb our nose at him and tell him, you know what? Yeah, nuts to you. And we're just going to make fun of you. And says, suddenly, verse 8, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote, and his face turned pale. He was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. That's some serious scared. As this unfolds, he calls for all the wise people to come in and interpret, what is this that's been written on the wall? Whose handwriting is this? What is this? And nobody can do it. Verse 10. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever, she said. Don't be alarmed. And I find it interesting that the one woman in the palace with authority is like nowhere near this party. She is too smart for this whole deal going down, right? But she hears the commotion and she comes in. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man. Somebody say there's a man. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods, and that would be a very Eastern way of thinking about anything that's divine. It was the spirit of the holy gods because there must be a lot of them. And in the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, astrologers, and diviners, and he did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel. Call for Daniel, and he'll figure this out for you. What does an extraordinary life look like? I want to suggest to you that there are really two paths to pursue, if you're even thinking down this path, and one would be the pathway to success. And Americans, we want a successful life, right? And what is a successful life? Good job, big house, lots of cars, not an orphanage. The Robs they got like every kid in the world going to live at their house this fall. Right? And plenty of what to retire with? Money, right? Success. I want to suggest to you that a successful life is not necessarily an extraordinary life. An extraordinary life is a life of, here it is, influence. Influence rather than success. There are 5 things here listed about Daniel, and I've listed them for you and given you little definitions, and so I'm going to walk through those real quick. A life of influence would be a life called an extraordinary spirit like Daniel, which is a positive attitude, always bringing fresh perspectives to every problem, and it will give other people hope. Knowledge and insight, constantly increasing in understanding and knowledge. Someone who gives wise advice that brings understanding to others. Interpretation of dreams. This is discerning what God is saying and being able to share his perspective. That'll bring confidence to others. I love this one. Explanation of enigmas, unsolvable things. The ability to make difficult things simple and comprehensible. And lastly, solving difficult problems. Others look to you when complicated challenges arise. Americans want one thing for sure. We want a life without what? Problems. A life without problems. That's what I want. Well, then what you really want is not life, because life is filled with one problem after another. Turn to your neighbor and say, we got plenty of problems. And if you run out of problems, just wait. You'll find some more. World War II produced lots of heroes. One such hero is a man named Butch O'Hare. He was a fighter pilot assigned to an aircraft carrier in the South Pacific. One day, his entire squadron was sent on a surprise mission, and in excitement to get airborne, he forgot to check his fuel. And sure enough, as he looked at his gauges, someone had forgotten to fuel the airplane. He would not have enough fuel to complete his mission and get back to his ship, and his flight commander told him to return to the carrier. Reluctantly, he dropped out of formation and headed back to the fleet. As he was returning to the fleet, he saw something that turned his blood cold. A squadron of Japanese Zeros were speeding their way toward the American fleet. The American fighters were gone on a sortie in this mission, and the fleet was completely defenseless. He was not going to be able to reach his squadron and bring them back in time, nor could he warn the fleet. This was before we had all of the technology that made that possible. Butch quickly determined that there was only one thing to do. He must somehow single-handedly divert this squadron from the fleet. Laying aside all thoughts of his own personal safety, he dove into the formation of Japanese planes. Wing-mounted .50 calibers blazed as he charged in, attacking one surprised enemy plane after another. He weaved in and out of the Japanese broken formation and fired at as many planes as possible until his ammunition was spent. Undaunted, he continued the assault. He dove with the Zeros, trying to at least clip off a wing or tail in hopes of damaging as many planes as possible and rendering them unfit to fly, which he did many. He was desperate to do anything he could to keep them from reaching their ships. Finally, the exasperated Japanese squadron took off in another direction. Good idea. It is reported he was deeply relieved. He and his tattered fighter limped back to the carrier, and upon arrival, he reported in and related the events surrounding his return. The film from the cameras mounting on his plane told the real story. It showed the extent of his daring attempt to protect the fleet. He was immediately recognized as a hero and again given one of the nation's highest military honors, the Medal of Honor. If you've ever been to Chicago, you've probably flown in and out of O'Hare Airport, named after him. This is a man of influence. Some years earlier, there was a man in Chicago named Easy Eddie. At that time, Al Capone virtually owned the city. Capone wasn't famous for anything heroic. His exploits were anything but praiseworthy. He was, however, notorious for enmeshing the city of Chicago in everything from bootleg liquor and prostitution to murder. Easy Eddie was Al Capone's lawyer, and for the good reason that he was the best lawyer in Chicago, the most successful. In fact, his skill at legal maneuvering kept Al out of jail for a long time. To show his appreciation, Capone paid him very highly. Not only was the money big, but Eddie got special dividends. For instance, he and his family occupied a fenced-in mansion with live-in help and all the conveniences of the day. The estate was so large that it filled an entire city block. Eddie lived a high life in Chicago and gave little consideration to the atrocities that went on around him. He did have one spot, however, and that was for his son that he dearly loved. Eddie saw to it that his young son had the best of everything: clothes, cars, and a good education. Nothing was withheld from this boy. No price was too high to provide for him. And despite his involvement with organized crime, Eddie even tried to teach him right from wrong. He tried to teach his son to rise above his own sordid life. He wanted him to have a better life than his was. Yet with all of his wealth and success, there were two things Eddie couldn't give his son. Two things that Eddie sacrificed in a compromised life to the Capone mob that he could not pass on to his beloved son: a good name and good character. One day, Easy Eddie reached a difficult decision. Offering his son a good name would become far more important than all the riches that could have been lavished on him. He decided to rectify the wrong that he was doing. He would go to the authorities and tell the truth about Scarface Al Capone, and this is a true story. He would try to clean up his tarnished name and offer his son some semblance of integrity. In doing this, he must testify against the mob, and he knew that it would cost him dearly. But more than anything, he wanted to be an example to his son. He wanted to do his best to make restoration and hopefully to leave his son a good name in the end. So he testified. Al Capone was convicted, placed in prison, but within that year, Easy Eddie's life ended in a blaze of gunfire on a lonely Chicago street. But in truth, he had then given his son the greatest gift that he had to offer, the greatest price he would ever pay. And I know you're probably wondering what these two stories have to do with each other. Easy Eddie's Butch O'Hare's father. It's never too late to get your heart back. It's never too late to train character. One of the things we believe in America is that character is something you have or you don't have, but the truth is we train character. It's never too late to get your heart back. Genuine character was Daniel's starting point. That's point number 1 in your notes. Character is what you are in the dark when no one sees. The truth is life is a grindstone. And whether it grinds you down to dust or polishes you to a high shine depends on what you are made of. There are a lot of stones in my life, and they would like to grind me to dust. But my hope is that as I train character and never stop training it, they're actually polishing. That your problems are the opportunity for you to live a life of influence. Turn to your neighbor and say, I want to think differently about problems. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 to 2, Peter writes, therefore, putting aside all malice, all deceit, all hypocrisy, all envy, and all slander, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word so that you may grow in respect to salvation. In Proverbs 20, verse 15, it says we're like precious stones. We are like precious stones to the Lord. And He wants you and I to be polished, to develop a character that will take us through. And He's saying, put aside these things and begin to develop your character. There's so much that's in this world system. And Daniel was a man weaned in the Lord. This is what I mean by that. Daniel learned to feed himself on the words of God and the life of God. We need as a people, especially as Americans, and this is just hard to fly in an American crowd, we need to wean off blaming everybody else for our problems. We need to wean off blaming God, blaming a spouse, blaming our just bad luck circumstances. Stand up and take accountability for our decisions and learn how to make better ones. You know how you learn to make better decisions? By encountering problems. Anybody here got a perfect record with problems? Jackie's like, man, I just got it figured out. Just none of us do, right? It's so much trial and error. But I want to make a better decision this time than I did last time, especially if I'd encounter a similar problem, right? Daniel was weaned in the Lord. He was a man who stayed a learner and was trained until he was genuine. Hebrews 5:14, those who are mature have trained themselves. Somebody say trained. Train themselves to recognize the difference between right and wrong and then do what is right. Some of you may have heard this analogy before. Let's just pick on Amber. Amber, you know, you're young and fit and just ready to rock and roll and all of that. And so let's just pretend this last week, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, showed up at your house, knocked on the door and said, we have put your name in the big computer that has all the names in America, and it has come out and said, you're the next winner of the Olympic marathon. And Amber's like, say what? She's like, you know, I'm kind of run from the bedroom to the fridge and then out to the TV, but it's like, you know, you're in. And she's like, cool. Well, I know something about Olympic marathon winners. They get a lot of money, endorsements, millions of dollars. Yeah, that's true. And so in 2 years when the Olympics come around again in the summer, you're it. She's like, cool. She goes out and she buys a jogging suit, tennis shoes. and she gets the official Olympic uniform mailed to her. What do you think she ought to do next? I don't know, put them up in the closet, have an eclair, maybe some donuts, and wait for the time to come. And she's going to get out there, put on the official outfit, and the starting gun's going to go. Everybody goes, and Amber's like, wait for me. Right? What are the chances of her winning the marathon? 0. But your chances go up exponentially if day one you go, I should probably try walking to the mailbox and back. And once I get that mastered, then I'm going to town and back. Then I'm going to start running, and I'm going to start training. I'm going to learn to eat right. I'm going to learn to do all of that stuff. The chances of doing well go up exponentially when we train. Turn to your neighbor and say, you're never too old to train your character. Never too old. Daniel stayed a learner. And my advice to everybody in the room, no matter how old you get, stay a beginner. Stay a beginner. Stay a learner. Keep learning. Never get too far beyond where it's like, I don't need to learn anything anymore. I've got it all figured out, at least everything that I'm interested in. And now the goal of my life is to retire and watch television. I mean, even as I say that and you laugh, I mean, can you imagine? Yeah. Number 2. Not only was genuine character Daniel's starting point, he was courageous in his faith. What happens is they call for Daniel. Verse 13, Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father, the king, had brought from Judah? Apparently, Daniel has fallen out of favor with King Nebuchadnezzar stepping aside and his son taking over. Daniel's not on scene. But this problem comes, and problems will surface the opportunity for the people of God to shine. Turn to your neighbor and say, you could shine. But when the next problem comes, you got to come too. Right? Are you Daniel? He says, I have heard that the Spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and understanding and wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they couldn't explain it. Now I've heard that you are able to give interpretation and solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. By the way, Daniel's already had that spot. But technically, he's in exile. Now, would you turn to your neighbor and say, exile is not your limitation. Every one of us get captured by things in this life. Circumstances come and they go, and we find ourselves at moments where we feel limited. Isn't that right? We just do. It just happens. This is how Daniel responded. Give your neighbor the elbow. And go ahead and say, I want to be like Daniel more than you. Here's what Daniel says. Keep your stuff for yourself. I love this. Daniel's already had this stuff. It says, keep your stuff for yourself. You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to somebody else. Nevertheless, I can read it. I can solve this problem for you. Daniel was courageous in his faith. He's saying, I don't live my faith for reward. I do it to please God and to serve people. And I will serve you in that role. If you read the story, Daniel then solves this problem and tells him what is written on the wall. What has happened is King Nebuchadnezzar, as I said earlier, had gone mad for a season. Had an encounter with the living God and surfaced from that encounter telling the whole kingdom, the Hebrew God is the God of the living world. And I serve him. But now his son has taken over, and that's probably what you do if your king goes a little nuts. Get another king. So the king's son comes up, and he knows all of this. Listen to this. Verse 22. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles and your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote this inscription. This is the inscription that was written in English. Mene, tekel, parsin. And here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And here's the best news of all. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar's at his command, Daniel's clothed in purple, a gold chain placed around his neck. He was proclaimed the third highest in the kingdom, and that very night Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Daniel was courageous in his faith. And here's the thing, if we please God with our thoughts and our thought life, our actions will easily follow. So my question this morning is, how's your thought life? As you are walking through this life, how are you thinking about God? How are you thinking about yourself? How are you thinking about the problems that you're encountering? Are you working overtime to get away from and out of problems, or are you facing them well? Are you joining your heart with others who are living the same courageous faith? The way Daniel dealt with problems was an extraordinary life, and it requires that you learn how to deal with them differently than others. And it will give people assurance for the future, and this is what I end with. Let me just say this. Jewel never ever has to worry that I'm going to divorce her or leave her wanting. She knows I'll stick with her because she can predict we'll go on being best friends and continue developing a quality of life and planning deep into the future based on what she knows of my character in the past and how I face problems that have come our way. She can depend on me to be the same today that I was a decade ago and a decade before that, and as old as I am, a decade before that, and a decade before that. If you hang around here at the bridge, you'll hear me occasionally say this. And I've written it down for you with a fill-in, though you could all fill it in, I'm sure, without me giving this to you. Every miracle starts with an unsolvable problem. Every one. I listen to the American church. We just need miracles. We just need the book of Acts. When you say that, you are saying, we just need some unsolvable problems. That's what we need. Well, on one hand, absolutely. Because it puts the invisible God on visible display. Through what kind of people? What? Say it again, Jewel. Ordinary. Somebody say ordinary. Now put the word extra in front of it. So think about it like that. Ordinary. Right here. What kind of ordinary, Sarah? Extra. Really ordinary. That's the word extraordinary. Think about it for just a moment. Is it possible to live an extraordinary life? Yes, it is, but you're going to have to change the way you think about problems. And desiring the miraculous is going to cause you to train your character. And we've said this before many times, and all of the kids in the room, when should you study for your next test? School's coming. How many kids in here? I can't wait for school to start. All the moms in the room, yes, please, school. So you start school, and I don't know, a week or two in. And if you've got one of those teachers, first day of class, there's a quiz. Maya Robb is like my favorite kind of teacher. I love that. So when should you study for your next test? You are my favorite. But did you catch his word? What was the operative word? Before. What should we do before our next problem? Pray. Train our character. Right? Choose to be weaned on the Lord, not the world system. Valuing His word above the circumstances that we get caught up in. Not blaming bad luck or someone else, but saying, Lord, right here, I'm responsible for my choices. Would you help me make better ones? And you know the very best place to do that is in your prayer life, wherever you're at your best. If you're me, that's early. Or God just likes to wake me. Some of you know this. He likes to wake me up in the night. And, I don't know how you do. Sometimes I'm like with it. I'm like, is that you, God? And get out of bed and kneel down and just pray and wait on Him and listen and all of that. And I'm on my A game. And then those other nights you're like, please go away. I'm really tired. But usually it's early for me. If you're Jewel Hawkins, it's always late. Right? A game is not early in the morning, right? And if she can rise and do all that sort of stuff, but, the big decisions, wait till later. Right? And so when you're at your best, turn to your neighbor and say, it's okay to be at your best whenever you're at your best. When you're at your best, would you give some of that time to God? God, would you speak to my heart? I'm listening. I'm looking into your word. I'm looking at your character, and I want to develop the best character I can, because sure as I'm sitting here, unsolvable problems are coming my way. They're coming. How will I engage them? Well, I want to be like Daniel. And it won't matter. Am I in a situation where I'm limited? Or am I in a moment of what seems like everybody thinks I'm great? Usually what comes right after everybody thinks you're great. Everybody thinks you're not so awesome, right? Because you just proved it. Right? That sort of thing. God, would you come? Help your people walk with you in such a way that others will gain confidence by the way we live. Others will be encouraged, because when problems come our way, we don't cave. We don't go down. And if we don't know what to do, we do two things. I love what Mandy said. We pray. Guess what the second thing is? You can write this down if you want. And if you don't have anything to write on, write this on your neighbor. How many of you have ever heard of Dr. Paul Yonggi Cho? A couple of people. Yonggi Cho. He's recently passed away. Seoul, South Korea, pastored the largest church on the face of the earth. Several million people in the church that he pastored. I love what Pastor Cho said back in the day, and everybody was like, how do you do it? He said, two things. I pray and I obey. What else, Pastor Cho? That's it. I pray and I obey. Let's bow our heads. Not because it's holy, just because it's private. Jesus, thank you for the example of Daniel. And these accounts in Scripture aren't just nice stories. They are true accounts of men and women who lived their lives for you. God, would you use Daniel to encourage us this morning? And as a family of believers, as we engage real life with real problems, would you come and show yourself the miraculous King of heaven? Would you lead us through? Would you train our character? Would you develop in us capacity for good? And oh God, when it gets dark, may we find ourselves genuine. Thank you for proving our faith genuine and using trials to do it. Lord, would you favor, would you bless, would you give relief, restoration, and refreshing to your people today? And as we go from this place, Lord, we started celebrating our kids. Lord, what a great way to start our day. And to say, God, may that life that they have and are experiencing bubble up and be available to all of us. May we walk in joy and in confidence because you are our Lord. May we not be like Belshazzar, who even though he saw in his father a man who would encounter the living God, he himself would choose to mock God. But rather may we be men and women and boys and girls who follow after you, who have hearts for you, and who invite others to do the same. In Jesus' name, everybody in the room said, amen. Before you leave this place, you're going to help pick up, set up that sort of thing. Find at least two people you haven't said hi to yet, and go say hi. Go pass out some hugs and give some love away.